The origins of the American dream. What were the roots of the post-war American consumer society that emerged after 1945? Now, it's important to point out that in certain respects, America had always been exceptional. There was a reason why it was called the New World. What made it new made it different from the Old World. So in a way, this idea of the Americas as a land of opportunity was inscribed on the Statue of Liberty. The idea that you could come on some immigrant ship in steerage with a few dollars in your pockets, and you could disembark not speaking the language, having any context, and just because of the amount of opportunities that were available, you could work your way up by your own bootstraps. So one of the big ideas of the United States is this ideology of rugged individualism. The idea that as a land of opportunity, there was no obstacle for you to reach your dreams as long as you were resilient and worked hard. And this type of resilience was often necessary because whether you were a frontier farmer, living in the wilderness, cutting down trees and beginning to plant, or moving as a foreigner to a city like New York, you needed to be tough and resilient to survive. But unlike so many other countries, you weren't limited by the class of your birth. In the United States, more so than any other nation of the world, although certainly this was also something that characterized Argentina and Canada, you were really just limited by the efforts that you put into it. Now, another aspect of American identity was the idea of a melting pot. It didn't matter if you were German, Greek. Once you came to the United States, you would rapidly assimilate, join the economic prosperity, adopt English, and become American. This was certainly an idea which was, feared by countries like Germany that were, scared at how many hundreds of thousands of their citizens they were bleeding to the United States, and how quickly they lost contact with the American, with their mother country, and identified as American. However, it's important to point out that the melting pot ideal is really a myth in many respects. Certainly many people maintain their ethnic identity. There were considerable prejudices against new immigrants, and of course there was very deep-rooted racial prejudices which prevented African Americans and other ethnic minorities like Asians and Native Americans from participating in the economic progress of the society as a whole. Now, even though upward mobility was characterized by the United States in its history, for example, you could come and get free land. That was the so-called Homestead Act, 160 acres, so you could establish your own farm. Although there was the potential, and certainly certain individuals did go from rags to riches, this was in a way exceptional. Many immigrants struggled, got poor land, were exploited in sweatshops. So the American ideal often fell short for many people. But still, looking at the American record over the longer term, on average, more people were able to ascend the social pyramid than certainly would have been the case in Europe and its old, more class-bound, more populated society. So it's for this reasons that one of the most important ideological kernels of the American dream is not equality in the socialist sense, the Marxist sense, This is one of the reasons why Americans are so hostile to communism. It's the idea of equality of opportunity. No one gets a handout. What we provide to you if you come here and join us is essentially the ability to go as high as you want to, depending on your effort and your ability. So it's a type of meritocracy, at least in theory, that everyone has equal opportunities. And this is also why socialism, in a way, didn't take hold in America after World War II. In Britain, the idea of fair share, that everyone who had sacrificed to win World War II should get an equal share, of the national wealth. Well, that didn't really resonate with the United States because that contradicted the principle of equality of opportunity. The only thing that the state needed to do was to provide an opportunity, for instance, for GIs to get educated and buy their house. And whether they made it or not, that was up to them and how hard they worked, how lucky they were, or how resilient they were. Now, when we focus in on the immediate post-war period from 1945 to 1947, where there was, a little bit of a recession and before the big post-war boom, what you see is that, the United States economy is as powerful as it was in 1945, probably producing over 60% of, the manufacturing goods in the world economy as a whole. There was still a pretty significant challenge. I mean, there had been a total war mobilization. The Arsenal for Democracy had essentially crushed the Axis alliance by just pumping out so many trucks and trains and planes that they simply just overwhelmed the more technologically advanced German forces or the more resilient Japanese forces. And bringing the boys home now, though there's going to be a very difficult two-dance step because on one hand, all of these war industries had to be transitioned to consumer production, and all of the fighting forces, over 8 million men, now needed to be incorporated into the workforce. But the idea of bringing the boys home was a rallying cry, and it was very clear to FDR and later to Truman that as soon as the war was over, they were going to need to demobilize and to return to the American norm of just having, essentially a very Spartan peacetime army. Now, for the industries of the United States, as hegemonic as they were in 1945, that didn't mean that they were going to automatically prosper in this new environment. For one thing, the United States had gone very deeply into debt, and this now needed to be repaid. The way it was repaid was principally through high taxes, especially the rich were paying about 90% effective tax rate on their income. There was essentially a very big fear of a post-war recession, and this was, of course, natural with this industrial transition to peacetime production, and also paying back all the loans. They also had the challenge of reabsorbing all these GIs into the workforce. So being able to transition to a peacetime economy, keeping the economy humming, was a very difficult challenge. And one of the key bodies that played a role in this was the Advertising Council, which really developed and promoted the modern advertising industry. So Madison Avenue in New York became famous, and one of the things that they were trying to do, which they saw in a very patriotic light, was to stimulate demand. In other words, to get people to buy goods, to make them dream for these consumer products. Because if you could get consumers to spend and buy products, it would allow these industries to transition, to hire more workers and expand production. When it came to socialism and government spending, it was really limited to the GIs, particularly for vocation, their schooling, so they could become more productive workers, and also for mortgages for their housing. The Federal Housing Administration was not in the business of building houses. They were going to let the free market do that, but they recognized that making a house or buying a house is a major investment. People didn't have any capital, So, in order to enable people to buy houses without capital, they provided essentially guarantees to banks so that the banks could give loans to GIs so that the GIs could buy houses. And by buying houses and cars, they could get the economy going. So, this was kind of the virtuous cycle that was powering the U.S. post war recovery. Now, if there was one idea that really captured the spirit of returning GIs, it would be the idea of settling down. And this captured different dimensions of their aspirations for post-war life. Settling down meant obviously they had to find a job, which in the immediate post-war era was relatively difficult. They wanted to find their own spread, and what that meant is they really preferred detached housing, so there'd be a little bit of space between you and the neighbors. They were coming from very overcrowded inner cities, where essentially people were living on top of each other in tenement housing. So they wanted to have a peaceful oasis to insulate them from all the stresses they'd experienced during the Great Depression and World War II. Settling down meant also, of course, starting a family, getting married, having children. It also meant, essentially turning the page on the horrors of war. Many men came back with what we today call post-traumatic stress syndrome. It wasn't as well understood, certainly at that time. There was a lot of alcoholism, which plagued former GIs, and it was in some ways the poor man's antidepressant. There was also a degree of cynicism about the big ideologies, fascism, the four freedoms. The states had mobilized ordinary people, sent them to war. They had suffered, they'd seen buddies die. They didn't really believe in those big ideas anymore. They really were focused on simple pleasures, being in the backyard, having a barbecue with neighbors. That was the good life. Most of all, they just wanted to turn the page on the war, and not just the war, but also, the preceding depression that had essentially marked their lives since early childhood. They were ready for some calm peace and tranquility. That's what the idea settling down really signified to them. So when you think about the conditions of post-war America, one pretty major difference between North America versus Western Europe was the degree to which the war had touched civilians and destroyed the urban fabric and the economy of that. For North America, World War II had in a sense been an economic boom period. So in that sense, there was less of a need to invest in reconstruction, and there was less call from the people to engage in major social or economic reform. The general belief of most people living in North America was they needed to enable, essentially step back, let the economy take care of itself, work through this transition, and once it recovered, there would be a lot of jobs and opportunity. People would be able to move into new homes, and as they earned a paycheck, settle down, prosperity would come for them. In Britain, where 10% of the housing stock had been destroyed, where industries had often been touched by the war, where there were very significant class differences, there was a much more systematic restructuring of society, and a much greater role and intervention of the government inside the economy as well. So, if there was, in a way, a unique, common experience with World War II and a desire to insulate people from the scourge of war, because this desire was manifesting in a different culture, in a different context, we shouldn't be surprised that post-war America emerged in a different form than that of Western Europe.